Okay, so we spent the last two sessions talking about everything that can go wrong in interviews and surveys and all sorts of research, both from a respondent side as well as from a fieldworker side. And in this session, we will talk about different ways to control these errors. So, different ways to at least limit the impact or minimize the occurrence of these errors. And ways to control for these types of errors really strongly depends on what type of error you're dealing with. If you're dealing with an intentional fieldworker error, such as cheating or leading respondents, the best thing you can do is supervision or validation. And supervision is literally what you think it is. It is adding a supervisor to a phone call when there's a phone interview, or adding some sort of external person to supervise the situation to make sure that interviewers or field workers do not cheat. Validation is a strategy that is usually done by recounting a certain part of the sample and asking them if they truly participated in the research. So the industry standard is to select about 10% of the sample, recontact them to find out if they really took part in the survey. So these are two very common ways to minimize intentional fieldworker error. But of course, to some extent, I believe that the best strategy really is educating field workers, training them in ethics to make sure that they don't do any wrongdoing. So just really to make sure that they don't commit any intentional fieldworker error. Unintentional fieldworker error are those errors that occur without them really knowing it or without them realizing it. So anything ranging from their own personal characteristics, misunderstandings, or fatigue. So some of the things you could do is properly training your interviewers. So doing role playing, orientation sessions, and so on. This will help make interviewers aware of, let's say, for example, their tone of voice, their demeanor, and so on, so that they can communicate questions or ask questions in a less biased way. Misunderstandings can also to some extent be helped or be corrected by proper training so that interviewers truly know what the questionnaire is really asking, so what the goal of the research is. And then lastly, with regards to fatigue, allowing for breaks and letting them alternate different surveys so that it doesn't get too boring for them is usually one of the best ways to minimize this type of unintentional fieldworker error. When it comes to intentional respondent errors, such as falsehood and non-response, there's a variety of things you can do. So again, you cannot control completely whether people will lie or not. So, again, that's beyond your control to some extent, but at least you can minimize the likelihood of falsehoods or non-response happening. So ensuring anonymity and confidentiality is key. You remember probably from when I explained the difference between anonymity and confidentiality before, that anonymity truly means that even the researcher does not know the identity of the respondent, whereas with confidentiality, the researcher does know but will not disclose this personally identifiable information to any third party, so it stays within the research context and does not leave a research setting. Also, offering incentives is really helpful to minimize falsehood. When people get a certain incentive for participating in research, it will usually trigger some sort of, how would I say, almost like a sort of guilt where they feel more inclined to do the right thing and to answer correctly. Validation checks can help as well, so that's another way to check if people are lying or not. Obviously, in some cases, you can't actually physically verify things, but if, for example, a person who is obviously very old says that they're very young in an interview, either that's a joke or they're plain lying. So to some extent, you can do some validation checks and look at what their answers were on previous questions to kind of see if they were answering correctly. But again, I think this is quite a punitive or quite a strict measure to take that sometimes borders privacy invasion. And then lastly, third-person technique, which we covered in the class about qualitative research, where respondents are allowed to project their own thoughts and feelings onto a fictitious third person. And this way, they may be less likely to misrepresent themselves. They might be more inclined to give honest answers. So simply because they don't feel that sort of shame or that personal focus when it comes to certain sensitive answers. Now, with regard to non-response, there's a couple things you can do as well, but we will cover non-response more in depth in the fourth session of this class. But again, ensuring anonymity and confidentiality helps minimize non-response. Providing incentives and having that third-person technique as part of your survey or your interview can definitely help as well. And then lastly, unintentional respondent errors such as misunderstandings, guessing, attention loss, distractions, and fatigue can be overcome basically by crafting a really, really good questionnaire. The better your questionnaire is, the less likely people, so your respondents, will misunderstand questions, or the less likely they will guess for an answer instead of giving an accurate answer. So specifically when it comes to guessing, a good thing to provide is a response option that says unsure. Because if you don't give an option unsure, respondents will tend to guess. They will just check whichever box they think applies to them best. But if you just give an option, I don't know, or I'm not sure, this way you overcome that guessing problem. And specifically with regard to attention loss, distractions, and fatigue, reversing scale endpoints can be a good way to check whether people are still paying attention. Let's say in the example here on the bottom of the slide, where you see a risk averseness scale, it consists of several items. I don't like to take risks. Compared to most people I know, I like to live on the edge. I have no desire to take unnecessary chances on things. So each of these three statements is to be answered on a Likert scale, ranging from 1 to 7, 1 being very much disagree, 7 being very much agree. Now, what you probably notice is that the second item is reversed. So it is in the opposite direction compared to the other two items. What I mean by that is the first and the third item, if you answer high on that scale, on that question or that statement, I don't like to take risks, that means you're not a risk taker. Same with the third one. I have no desire to take unnecessary chances on things. If you give yourself a 7 on that scale, that means you are not a risk taker. However, the second item is reversed such that people indicating a high agreement, so let's say a 6 or a 7 on that scale, will actually tend to be risk takers. So a respondent who's truly paying attention will notice that one item is reversed and will answer consistently. If they're risk takers, they will evaluate themselves or rank themselves high on the first and the third item, but not, actually the opposite, will indicate a low score on the first and the third item and a high score on the second item. So reversing scale endpoints can really be helpful to see if respondents were just going on autopilot and checking just random boxes, or whether they were actually answering truthfully. Prompters can help as well, and prompters are short statements that are included, let's say halfway through a survey or through an interview, that says something along the lines of, we're almost halfway, or we're almost done. These statements are basically used to motivate people to continue to the end. So even if they get distracted or fatigued, you still encourage them to really stick it out until the end.